At a family barbecue, my wife raised her glass and said, "You'll die alone. After me, no one will look at you twice." I said nothing and just looked at her. The next morning, before she woke up, I sat with a notary and removed her name from every page of my will. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. I'm 53 years old. I've been married to the same woman for 27 years. I worked for almost 3 decades as a tax auditor, a job that has nothing glamorous about it, but that taught me one thing few people learn in time. Numbers don't lie. People do. Numbers never. That October afternoon, while the smoke from the grill still floated over the garden and my children's eyes were still glued to their plates, I took a sip of water, carefully placed the glass on the table, and nodded in silence. Rosario interpreted that gesture as she'd always interpreted things in me. Resignation, submission. Old Emilio, swallowing it again, she was wrong. The next morning, before she opened her eyes, I was already sitting across from Teodoro Sense Molina in his notary's office on Santiago Street, with my will spread out on the table and a pen in my hand. Teodoro has known me since technical school. He looked at me over his glasses with that expression of his that says, "Don't give me any stories," and said, "Tell me what you need to change." I told him to start from the beginning, to erase everything that was written and start from scratch. But to understand what happened that morning at the notary's office and why every decision I made in the following months was exactly the right one, I need to tell you who I was before that barbecue, who Rosario was, and what kind of silence we had built between us for over a quarter of a century. My full name is Emilio Fuentes Carrasco. I was born in Valladolid in the winter of 1971, the second of 3 brothers in a family where money was always just enough and never left over. My father worked in a metal components factory on the outskirts. My mother sewed at home on commission when she could. I grew up in a 3-bedroom apartment where the heat in winter depended on how much we'd been able to pay at the end of the month. It wasn't a miserable childhood. It was a childhood where you learned the value of things because no one gave them to you. I studied on a scholarship, first high school, then technical training in administration and taxation. At that time, in the early 90s, Spain was coming out of a crisis that had left many of my father's acquaintances jobless overnight. I'd arrive at the technical school on the 7:15 bus with a folder under my arm and the previous day's notes still fresh in my head. There were no personal computers in the classrooms. There were calculators, paper, and the teacher's voice dictating while you wrote as fast as you could. I learned to be precise because imprecision was expensive. A misplaced decimal could ruin an entire balance sheet. At 22, I started as an assistant in a small accounting firm in downtown Valladolid. I earned little, but I learned a lot. At 25, after preparing for 2 years with manuals I bought secondhand at the Sunday flea market, I passed the civil service exam for tax agency technician. The day the letter with the favorable resolution arrived, I went to the corner bar, ordered a coffee with milk, and stared at the paper for a good while without being able to fully read it, because my eyes were watery and I didn't want the bartender to see me. I met Rosario Valverde Diaz a year later at a coworker's wedding. She had gone with a friend. She was 24, with her brown hair in a loose braid and a way of laughing that filled the entire room. She wasn't the type of woman who tried to impress. She was the type of woman who didn't need to. We talked for 3 straight hours that night, standing by the bar, while the music was too loud for the venue and everyone else danced without paying us any attention. We got married 2 years later, in September 1998. Civil ceremony, lunch with our families, no great pretensions. I was 27, she was 26. We settled in a rented apartment in the delicious neighborhood, while I continued to accumulate years of service, and she worked as an administrative assistant at an insurance company. We lived on just enough, and we managed it well. Those first years were hard but honest. When we argued, it was about real things, bills, the car that needed a checkup, whether we could afford to visit her family for Christmas. Marcos was born in 2001. Then Carmen arrived 3 years later. Rosario left her job to stay with the children for a while. I assumed that was the right thing to do, that it was what we should do, and I went on with my head buried in tax files and overtime. What I didn't see then, what I couldn't see until much later, was that while I was building stability, she was building a loneliness that no stability can compensate for. I acknowledged that failure. I'm not saying it to soften what came later, because nothing I did wrong justifies what she chose to do. But it will be dishonest not to admit it. I worked too much. I arrived late too many times. I let the years pass without asking how she really was. Not the how are you of the hallways, but the real one, the one that requires sitting down, turning off the phone, and waiting for the answer, even if it's uncomfortable. I left that pending for too long. The funny thing is that for years I was convinced we were a functional marriage. Not passionate, not a movie-like one, but solid. Rosario organized the house with an efficiency I admired without ever telling her. When I had endless workdays, she coordinated the children's schedules, solved unforeseen problems, hosted my colleagues at home when necessary, and made everything seem natural. There were good moments, many of them. A rainy afternoon in 2003 when we both stood at a traffic light with the radio on and neither of us felt the need to speak, and that silence felt light, almost comfortable. Vacations on the Cantabrian coast, when the children were little and still fell asleep in the car. The shared satisfaction when we bought our own apartment in 2007, the same one we'd been living in all these years. But there's a sentence Rosario said at our 25th wedding anniversary dinner 2 years ago that I couldn't quite shake, no matter how much I tried to attribute it to fatigue. We were in a quiet restaurant, just the two of us. And at some point in the evening between the second course and dessert, she put her fork down on the plate with a strange calm and said, "You were always here, Emilio, but you never fully arrived." She didn't say it with anger. She didn't say it crying. She said it like someone stating something they've known for a long time and no longer feel any particular emotion about. I responded awkwardly, something along the lines of having worked for the family, that she knew it well. She smiled with that politeness of people who no longer expect to be understood and changed the subject. I didn't think about that sentence again until the night of the barbecue, until she raised her glass and spoke in front of the children. That night, after the last guest had left and Rosario had cleaned the kitchen with her usual efficiency, I stayed seated in the dark garden with the last glass of water in my hand and the embers dying in the grill. The sky over Vito Lead was clear, cold, cloudless. I thought about the sentence. I analyzed it the way I'd analyze any file. I looked for its origin, its intention, its real recipient. It wasn't an outburst. It wasn't the product of a bad day or too much wine. It was a declaration, one that had been waiting a long time to be spoken aloud. I went to bed without saying anything. At 6:15, the next morning the alarm went off. Rosario was still asleep. I got dressed in silence. I left a note in the kitchen saying I had an errand and left. At 8:10, I was parking in front of Teodoro's notary office. At 8 o'clock, I was sitting across from him. What I did that morning was just the first step, but it was the step that changed everything. The first apartment Rosario and I rented together smelled of old paint and damp wood. It was a third-floor walk-up on Panadero Street, with a kitchen window overlooking an inner courtyard where neighbors hung their laundry and chatted loudly among plants. The floor was hydraulic tile, cold in winter and also cold in summer, and the boiler took 10 minutes to provide hot water if the day was cloudy. Rosario cleaned it from top to bottom the weekend before we moved in. She scrubbed every tile, organized the kitchen with her own logic that I never would have achieved. She placed a small pot of basil on the windowsill. When I came in with the first boxes, she told me it already felt like a home. I looked at the pot, looked at the gleaming floor, and thought she was right. That was in the autumn of 1998. We were 27 and 26 years old, respectively. I earned a fixed salary from the tax agency that was enough to live without being tight if you were organized with expenses. Rosario was still at the insurance company where she had worked for the last 3 years. Between the two of us, we made it to the end of the month with enough room to save something, not much, but something. Back then, saving any amount was already a victory. What I remember most from those early years aren't the big moments. It's not the wedding. It's not signing the first rental contract. It's none of those dates you're supposed to remember. What I remember most clearly is a Tuesday in February of the year, 2009 at night, with both of us sitting on the living room floor because we still didn't have a sofa eating ham sandwiches with the news on in the background. Rosario had her bare feet propped on my leg and was reading a magazine without paying much attention to the screen. It was raining outside. The heating made that dull noise of old pipes. And I thought, with all the clarity a 28-year-old man can have, that this was exactly what I wanted. No more and no less. I was wrong in how I took care of it. I know that now. The career at the agency gradually absorbed more and more time as the years went on. Not all at once, but little by little, the way important things are always lost gradually, almost without noticing, until one day you look back and don't recognize the path you've traveled. The audits became more complicated, the files piled up. There were tax closing seasons when I'd get home after 10 at night for weeks on end. Rosario would have dinner ready. I'd eat in silence. I'd mentally review what was pending for the next day and fall asleep before midnight. When the children were born, she took on most of the domestic burden with an organizational capacity I always admired, although I was terrible at expressing it. Marcos arrived in 2001, Carmen in 2004. Rosario left her job to stay with them when the little one was a few months old and the rhythm of the house made it impossible otherwise. We made that decision together, or at least I thought so for a long time. Now I think she made it alone, resigned to the fact that the alternative was for me to reduce my hours, and she already knew that wasn't going to happen. There was something Rosario did in those years that I never mentioned to anyone because I would have struggled to find the right words. When I came home from a long week away for an audit in another province, she didn't ask how it went, nor did she expect a detailed explanation. She just made sure there was hot coffee, that the desk in my study was tidy, that the children didn't make noise for that first hour. She let me land. It was a small, concrete generosity that for years I took for granted, as if it were a feature of the furniture and not a choice she made each time. That's what stuck with me when I started to review the last few years with the distance that comes from knowing what you know, not the resentment, not the betrayal yet, but that memory of something genuinely good that existed and that at some point turned into something else without either of us stopping the process. The turning point, if I had to name one, I'd place it around 2015. The children were already 14 and 11. The apartment mortgage was halfway paid. I'd been promoted to area chief inspector, and the job, if possible, had become even more demanding. Rosario had been out of the workforce for over 10 years. When I asked her that year if she wanted to go back, if she wanted to look for something now that the children were more independent, she said she'd think about it. She didn't go back. And I, instead of sitting down to really talk about what she needed, assumed the answer was no and moved on with my files. What I didn't see was that she had stopped asking me for things, not suddenly, with a dramatic declaration. She had simply stopped trying. And when a person stops asking, it's not because they no longer need, it's because they've concluded that asking is useless. In 2020, I left the agency. 28 years of service, a decent pension, and the feeling that if I voluntarily reviewed one more official file, something in me would break irreparably. I took early retirement at 51. I thought that would change things between Rosario and me, that finally having time would give us the opportunity to recover some of what had been lost over all those years. The first few months we were at home together more than in the entire previous decade. We'd go for walks in the mornings, sometimes we'd have breakfast out. It seemed like a readjustment was possible, a new, slower version of what we had been, but the readjustment never came. Or it came too late, or it came for one of us and not the other. Rosario had built a life of her own during all those years I was absent. A network of friends, activities, routines that didn't include me and weren't designed to include me. When I suddenly became available for the first time in decades, the space I would have occupied was already inhabited by other things. I'm not saying this as an accusation. I'm saying it because that's what happens when you leave voids for too long. Someone ends up filling them, if only to not go crazy from the silence. We celebrated our 25th anniversary in a downtown restaurant Rosario had wanted to go to for some time. The dinner was quiet, proper, with no apparent tension. At some point during the second course, without me having said anything particularly clumsy or particularly significant, Rosario put her fork on the edge of her plate, stared at her glass for a moment, and said in a completely neutral tone, "You were always here, Emilio, but you never fully arrived." I tried to respond with something. I said I'd worked for the family, that she knew it better than anyone, that it hadn't been easy for either of us. She smiled in that way people do when they no longer expect the other to understand. And she changed the subject with a naturalness that I found more bewildering than any argument. We didn't talk about it again that night. I paid the bill. We went home. She went to bed before me. I tucked that sentence away in some corner and moved on. That was in September 2 years ago. The following October was the barbecue, and the morning after the barbecue, while Rosario was still sleeping in the room with the door ajar, I was already standing in the kitchen listening to the silence of the house and making a decision that had been, without my knowing it, brewing for longer than I thought. It wasn't a decision made in anger. It was a decision made with the same coldness with which for almost 3 decades I had reviewed balance sheets and detected anomalies without haste, without noise, with the certainty of someone who knows that when the numbers don't add up, the first thing you have to do is document everything before moving a single figure. I left the house at 6:40. I left a note on the kitchen counter that said I had to run an errand. I got in the car with my briefcase, my keys, and something I hadn't felt in years. The absolute clarity of someone who knows exactly what they have to do. But what I would find in the following days, what I would begin to see when I finally decided to really look, was something for which no anniversary, no sentence in a restaurant, and no family barbecue had fully prepared me. 3 weeks after the barbecue, on a Wednesday morning, I came back from the doctor's office earlier than expected. It was nothing serious, a routine checkup that ended sooner than expected because the previous patient had canceled. It was 11:15. I parked on the street, walked up the stairs slowly, opened the door with my key without making a sound because Rosario had a habit of listening to music in the mornings and usually didn't hear when someone came in. That morning there was no music, there was a voice. Rosario's in the living room, talking on the phone with that relaxed cadence people have when they're completely sure they're alone. I froze in the hallway with my coat still on and my briefcase in my hand. It wasn't a business conversation. It was a conversation of trust, the kind you have with someone you don't have to explain the context to because they already know everything. "He was always more of an accountant than a husband," she said and laughed. A soft laugh with no apparent malice, like someone stating something that's been true for years and no longer causes any pain. I stood motionless, my hand gripping the briefcase handle. I heard the other person's response, which I couldn't make out. Then Rosario continued in the same calm tone. "No, I'm not complaining. I'm just saying there are some things that can't be fixed at this point." There was a pause. Then she talked about something else, about a friend who had changed hairdressers, and the conversation drifted into completely banal territory, but I was still in the hallway, without moving, processing those 2 sentences with the same attention with which for decades I had processed inconsistencies in tax returns. More accountant than husband, things that can't be fixed. I waited for the call to end. Well, I heard her hang up. I waited 30 more seconds. Then I made a deliberate noise. I let the briefcase fall with a dry thud on the hallway floor. I cleared my throat. I closed the front door as if I had just arrived. Rosario appeared in the hallway with the phone still in her hand and an expression that took a fraction of a second longer than usual to become natural. "I didn't hear you come in," she said. "Did they finish early?" I replied, "Is there coffee?" "I just made it." She turned towards the kitchen. I hung my coat on the rack calmly. My hands weren't shaking. That surprised me. I drank the coffee standing by the counter while she organized some papers on the dining room table with that efficiency of hers I had always admired. We talked about minor things that Carmen had called the day before, that we needed to check the leak in the bathroom, the conversation of a couple who's lived together for decades and has turned the everyday into the only language they have left. I responded normally. I asked normal questions. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, and told her I was going down to buy the newspaper. She didn't look up from the papers. All right. I went out to the landing, closed the door gently, and stood on the landing for 10 full seconds. The building smelled of old staircase dampness and something that might be a stew from an upstairs apartment. The floor tiles had that usual coldness. 10 seconds. Then I went down the stairs and out to the street. I didn't go to buy the newspaper. I sat on a bench in the square opposite and stayed there for 20 minutes with the November cold seeping into my collar, thinking about the difference between a sentence said in anger and a sentence said with resignation. Anger still contains expectation. Resignation doesn't. And what I had heard that morning in the living room had no anger in it. That evening, Marcos came for dinner. He did it every 2 or 3 weeks without a fixed pattern. He'd show up with that ease of someone who knows his parents' fridge is also his. He'd leave his jacket on the rack without asking and settle in the kitchen while serving himself something. He was 26. His recently framed law degree in the apartment I paid for downtown, and that quiet confidence of someone who's never had to calculate too much what he spends because there was always someone behind him calculating it for him. I arrived at the apartment a few minutes after him. I was coming from a walk that had gone on longer than planned. I opened the door with the key, and before entering the living room, I heard their voices in the kitchen. They were talking in low voices, low enough not to be clearly heard in the hallway. I stopped, not because I decided to, but because my body did it first. "It's time the old man understood that things change," said Marcos. A pause. Rosario's voice, even lower, replied with something I couldn't make out. Marcos again, with a tone that tried to sound practical and only managed to sound cold. "Don't worry. He has his way of seeing things, and that's it. He's not going to complicate anything." I pushed the door open normally, as if I hadn't been standing in the hallway. I went into the living room, left my coat on the chair, and said aloud that I was home. In the kitchen, there was a half-second of silence. The kind of silence that doesn't exist when the conversation is innocent. Then Marcos peeked his head through the door with a smile. "Hi, Dad. We didn't hear you arrive." "I just got here," I said. It was technically true. The dinner was calm on the surface. Marcos talked about a case he'd been working on with the firm where he collaborated about a client with problems with a poorly documented inheritance. Rosario served the second course and participated in the conversation with her usual lightness. I ate and listened and answered when they asked me something, but I was recording. I recorded the way they looked at each other when they thought my eyes were on my plate. I recorded the silences they chose, the words they didn't say, the space they left between what they talked about in front of me and what they clearly talked about when I wasn't there. Marcos left after 10. At the door, he said goodbye with the usual hug, that hug a young man who still hasn't quite learned how to do it, a bit clumsy, a bit rushed. I told him to drive carefully. He said he would, with that confidence of someone who doesn't expect their parents to be right about anything worrying. I closed the door. Rosario was already cleaning the kitchen. I sat on the living room sofa with the TV remote in my hand and the screen off. I stayed like that for 5 minutes with the remote between my fingers without turning anything on, mentally reviewing every detail of the last few hours. The old man understands that things change. He's not going to complicate anything. Marcos had a law degree. He knew exactly what those sentences meant in the context in which he had said them. He wasn't a teenager talking for the sake of talking. He was a trained adult choosing his words with an awareness of their weight. That's what weighed the most. Not the sentence itself, but the certainty that behind it was reasoning, not emotion. That night, I slept with apparent normality, or at least that's how it must have seemed from the outside. Inside was another matter. Inside was the specific calm of someone who has crossed an invisible line and already knows there's no going back to the side they came from. The next day, before Rosario came down for breakfast, I opened the desk drawer where we kept the bank statement from the last few years. I took them all out. I put them on the table in chronological order. I started reviewing them with a pen in my hand, pointing out dates, marking amounts, building a picture that was still incomplete, but that already had enough shape to be disturbing. I heard her footsteps in the hallway. I put the statements in the folder, closed the drawer calmly, and picked up the previous day's newspaper that was on the table. When Rosario opened the office door to tell me that breakfast was ready, she found me reading the business pages with my coffee on the side, exactly like any other morning. "I'm coming," I said without looking up. She nodded and went back to the kitchen. The statements were put away, but what I had seen in the first 15 minutes of review was already enough to know that what Marcos and Rosario were preparing was much more concrete, much more advanced, and much more expensive than I had calculated the night before. And that was just the surface. What was left to discover was still buried underneath. It was Saturday, 11:14 in the morning, according to the kitchen clock, one of those wall clocks that's been hanging in the same place for so long that you don't look at it anymore. You just hear it. Rosario had left early to see a friend. She told me the name. She told me the neighborhood. She told me she'd be back for lunch. I was in the kitchen looking for a pen, a blue one of the kind that was always in the entryway drawer and that invariably disappeared when you needed it most. I checked the entryway drawer. Nothing. I checked the desk drawer. Not there either. I remembered that Rosario sometimes put things in the inner pocket of her large bag, that brown leather one she always left hanging on the hook in the bedroom. It wasn't her everyday bag. It was the one she used for going out. I'd seen it that morning. When she left, I went to the bedroom, took it down, opened the inner compartment. There was no pen. There was a paper folded in four. I would have ignored it. I should have ignored it, left it where it was, looked for the pen somewhere else. But the paper was folded with that specific precision of documents you keep so you don't lose them, not receipts or shopping lists, but things that matter. I took it out. I unfolded it on the bed. It was a handwritten list in Rosario's handwriting, that round, neat handwriting I'd seen for 27 years on fridge notes, on birthday cards, in the margins of the books she read. 4 columns. In the first, names of assets, the apartment on Encarnacion Street, the garage, the joint account at Banco Santander, the fixed-term deposit, the vehicle in both our names. In the second column, approximate values that someone had estimated quite accurately. In the third, what stopped me? My name, Emilio Fuentes Carrasco, written in each row and crossed out with a horizontal blue pen line. Not a quick slash, a deliberate, uniform line drawn calmly. In the fourth column, replacing my name in each row, hers, Rosario Valverde Diaz. I stared at that paper for a time I couldn't measure. The kitchen clock kept ticking. That ticking you never hear until suddenly it's the only thing you hear. The coffee I'd made earlier was on the counter, already cold. Through the bedroom window came a white, flat November light that gave no warmth to anything. The first thing my body noticed was the cold, a cold that had nothing to do with the room temperature. My hands continued to hold the paper without trembling, but my chest tightened in a way that wasn't exactly pain, but something like when something you thought was secure is suddenly taken away. The brain took a few more seconds. First, to try to find an alternative explanation, an innocent one, because that's what the brain does when it doesn't want to accept what's in front of it. Maybe it was an organizational list for some paperwork. Maybe there was some context I didn't know, but my name was crossed out, hers was written above it, and the values on that list were too precise to be a casual approximation. Someone had made a serious estimate, someone with access to specific information about our assets. I folded the paper exactly as it was, with the same folds, in the same order. I put it back in the inner compartment of the bag, in the same position I had found it. I hung the bag on the hook in the bedroom. I left the room. I went to the kitchen. I leaned against the counter with both hands flat on the cold marble and breathed slowly, the way you learn to breathe when you've spent decades managing situations that require the outside not to reflect what's happening inside. 3 minutes. I gave myself 3 minutes to process what I'd seen. Then I went to the study, took out the folder with the bank statements I'd started reviewing days before and spread them on the table. This time I looked at them differently, not looking for general anomalies, but confirming something specific. And the estimates on the paper matched the real balances. They matched with a difference of less than 3%, which meant that whoever had prepared that list had access to updated information from our accounts, not from memory, not by estimation, by direct consultation. Rosario was a co-owner of all the accounts. She had legal access to all that information. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that someone had organized it into a document with my details crossed out and hers written above, and that document was stored in the inner compartment of a bag that wasn't the one she used daily. I put everything away. I tidied the study exactly as it was before. I sat in the armchair and was still for 10 more minutes, letting the information settle before I moved. Rosario arrived at 1:15. She came in with shopping bags she had picked up on the way, hung up her coat, greeted me from the hallway with her usual normality, and went straight to the kitchen to put things away. I was sitting on the living room sofa with the newspaper open to the sports pages, which is the section I'm least interested in the world, but it has the advantage of seeming completely innocuous. "Are we eating soon?" she asked from the kitchen. "Whenever you want," I replied. There was a moment that almost complicated everything. Rosario came out of the kitchen to go to the bedroom. I assumed to leave her bag. I kept my eyes on the newspaper, listening to her footsteps. I heard her take the bag off the hook. I heard the sound of the metal clasp, a silence of 4 or 5 seconds that felt long to me. Then I heard her hang the bag back up, and her footsteps moving away towards the bathroom. I turned the page of the newspaper carefully. When she came back to the living room and sat next to me before starting to prepare lunch, she looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite classify. It wasn't clear suspicion. It was more of a slightly different attention than usual, like when someone mentally checks if something is in its place without knowing exactly what they're checking for. "Are you okay?" she said. "Yes." I folded the newspaper, a little tired. "I slept badly." She nodded. "The bathroom leak is back. We have to call the plumber. I'll call him tomorrow." She got up and went to the kitchen. I stayed on the sofa for another 2 minutes with the newspaper folded on my lap, controlling my breathing so it wouldn't give anything away. It didn't. What came after that afternoon was a complete reorientation of how I processed what was happening. Until that Saturday, what I had were phrases heard by chance, behaviors that could be read in more than one way, a diffuse unease that could have been attributed to the normal wear and tear of a long marriage. But the paper changed everything. The paper was a document and documents, unlike words spoken in a low voice or glances exchanged across the table, don't allow for interpretation. They are what they are. That night, when Rosario went to bed, I stayed in the study until after midnight. I reviewed every bank statement from the last 36 months with the thoroughness of someone who knows exactly what to look for. I wasn't looking for obvious fraud. I was looking for a pattern, small, regular transfers, spaced irregularly to avoid attention. The type of movement you only detect if you know what you're looking at and have enough time to build the complete picture. At 12:43, I found the first one. €870 transferred to an account ending in 4 digits I didn't recognize. 3 weeks earlier, 790, 2 months before that, 840. Different amounts, different dates, but the same destination number. I took a blank sheet of paper from the drawer, noted down the 3 movements with their dates and amounts, and continued reviewing backwards. Before I went to bed, I had noted down 16 different movements spread over the last 2.5 years. 16 transfers, none exceeding €900, all to the same unknown destination. I didn't add up the total figure that night. I left it for the next day when I had all the data, but I already knew the sum was going to be significant. And I also knew that an account to which someone transfers money in amounts carefully below a certain threshold, with a studied irregular regularity to not create a visible pattern, is not a household account. It was an account someone had opened, so I wouldn't find it, and whoever had opened it knew enough about how financial irregularity detection works to try to avoid it. What I still didn't know that night was who else, besides Rosario, was aware of all this. That answer would come soon, and it would be the part that would be hardest to accept. The following Monday, I went to the bank first thing, not to our usual branch, but to the main office on the avenue, where the volume of customers was higher and the manager who attended me wasn't someone who had known me for years. I requested a complete account statement for the last 36 months for all accounts linked to my client number. The employee, a young man with thin-rimmed glasses, took a few minutes to print everything. He handed me an envelope with several sheets and asked if I needed anything else. I told him no, that was enough. I sat in the car parked in front of the bank and spent 2 hours reviewing each page with a pen in my hand. Not the blue pen I had been looking for on Saturday, a new one bought that morning at a tobacco shop that no one else had touched. The final sum was €41,200 transferred in 43 different operations over 3 years, distributed with a studied irregularity that, to the eyes of anyone without specific training, would have looked like the normal movement of an active domestic account, amounts ranging between €600 and €890. Never above 900. Never 2 transfers to the same destination in the same month. A pattern designed not to be one. I had spent 28 years detecting exactly this type of structure in the tax returns of medium-sized companies trying to move money without the agency seeing it. The irony was not lost on me. That same afternoon, I called Valentin Rueda Serrano. I had met him years ago through a colleague from the agency who had worked with him on a tax fraud case with ramifications in several provinces. Valentin had been a civil guard for 16 years, an inspector in the Economic Crimes Unit, and had been working on his own as a private investigator in Segovia for 6 years. He was 44 years old, a direct and straightforward way of speaking that I had always appreciated, and a reputation for absolute discretion that at that moment was worth more than any other consideration. I called him from the prepaid mobile I had bought that same morning in a call shop downtown. Not from my usual phone, he answered on the second ring. I told him who I was. There was a brief pause. Fuentes, he said, long time no see. I explained the essentials without going into details I wasn't yet clear on. I told him I needed to document a person's movements and contacts for a minimum of 3 weeks. I told him that discretion was non-negotiable. Valentin listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said he could start on Wednesday. I told him Wednesday was fine. We agreed to meet on Tuesday in a cafeteria in Segovia to finalize the terms. That night at home was one of the longest of that entire period, not because of what happened, but precisely because of what didn't happen. Dinner was like any other dinner. Rosario had made lentils with chorizo, which was one of those winter dishes she had always made well. We ate with the TV on to the 9 o'clock news. We talked about how Carmen had sent a message saying she would visit the following weekend. Rosario said we had to prepare the guest room. I said yes, she was right. There was no sign of anything, and that, paradoxically, was the hardest thing to bear. When a threat has a visible face, the body knows how to position itself. When the threat lives with you in complete normality and serves you lentils and talks about the guest room, the tension has nowhere to settle. It just floats without an anchor. On Tuesday, I drove to Segovia. I told Rosario I had an errand with Teodoro that I would probably be all morning. It was an excuse she wasn't going to question because meetings with the notary were something that had happened with some regularity since I retired and started reorganizing some administrative matters I had left pending during my working years. Valentin arrived at the cafeteria before me. I recognized him from the door. The same contained demeanor as always, the same way of sitting facing the entrance that people have who have spent years in environments where knowing who comes through the door wasn't habit, but a necessity. We ordered coffee. I put the sheet with the 43 movements noted down on the table and a written description of what I had observed in recent weeks. He read it slowly, without commenting as he read. When he finished, he folded the sheet and said, "The destination account is the first thing. Without knowing who it belongs to, everything else is a baseless construction." I told him I had the last 4 digits, that if he could cross-reference them with something, with any data that would allow identifying the owner, it would be the most solid starting point we had. Valentin said he would try through indirect means. He couldn't directly access bank data without a court order, but there were triangulation methods that in similar cases had yielded results. I gave him the digits. I also gave him Rosario's name, her identification number, and the details of the apartment where we lived, everything that could be useful for context. Before I got up, I asked him to also document any regular contact Rosario had with legal professionals. I didn't explain why. Valentin nodded without asking. That was another of his qualities. The first week was silent. Valentin worked without reporting until he had something concrete, as we had agreed. I maintained the routine at home with a precision that began to feel exhausting, not because of the effort itself, but because of the accumulation. Every morning was a performance. Every conversation with Rosario was a balance between seeming like my old self and not being it at all. The most delicate moment of that week happened on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the study with the folder of statements open on the table when Rosario opened the door without knocking. She usually did. It was a habit we'd had for years. Not this time. She came in with a cup of coffee in her hand and left it on the edge of the table. Her gaze went directly to the open folder. Only for a second, but it was a full second. "What are you reviewing?" she asked. I didn't look up from the papers immediately. I waited just the right amount of time. I would have waited if the question were completely innocuous. Then I looked at the insurance policies. I want to see if it makes sense to change any policies now that I'm no longer working. Some terms change with retirement. Rosario looked at the folder for another moment, then looked away. Teodoro can guide you better than you can alone. I know. That's why I'm reviewing it before I go see him, so I don't arrive without knowing what to ask. She nodded, turned around, and left. I closed the folder with a slow movement, drank the coffee, and waited for her footsteps to fade down the hallway. Then I opened the folder again and continued. Valentin's report arrived 9 days after our meeting in Segovia. He handed it to me in the same cafeteria, a sealed envelope with 4 pages inside. I read it there with the coffee on the table and him sitting across from me without saying anything while I processed each paragraph. The destination account was registered in the name of Rosario Valverde Diaz, an individual account opened at a different bank than ours, 6 months before the first transfer. That was clear enough, but it wasn't what stopped me in my reading. What stopped me was page 3. Valentin had documented that Rosario had visited a law firm specializing in family law and separation proceedings on Montero Calvo Street on 6 different occasions over the past 8 months. The owner of the firm was a lawyer named Gerardo Palacios Vidal, with 15 years of practice and specialization in the liquidation of marital property and asset division in contentious divorces. 6 visits in 8 months. It wasn't a consultation, it was a preparation. And on page 4, the detail that changed the weight of everything before. On the 3rd visit to the firm, recorded with date and time, Rosario had not gone alone. Valentin had documented the entry of 2 people, Rosario, and with her, with a 10-minute difference so as not to coincide at the door, Marcos Fuentes Valverde. My son had entered the office of a lawyer specializing in contentious divorces accompanying his mother. At 26, with a law degree, knowing exactly what kind of professional Gerardo Palacios Vidal was and exactly what kind of document would be waiting for his signature. I put the page on the table. I looked at Valentin. Is there more? I asked. Valentin opened his coffee cup, held it with both hands, and said, There's one more thing, but I need 3 more days to confirm it before I give it to you in writing. Something in his tone told me that what remained to be confirmed was worse than what I had just read. I told him to take the time he needed, that I was in no hurry, that I had learned many years ago that an unclosed file is much more dangerous than one that hasn't even been started. I put the envelope in my briefcase, paid for the 2 coffees, and went out to the street. The December cold in Segovia was dry and direct, the kind that gets between your clothes without asking permission. I walked to the car without hurrying. I had 3 days to find out what Valentin hadn't told me yet. And something in the way he had looked at me before speaking indicated that those 3 days were going to be the hardest of all I had been enduring. I didn't sleep that night. It wasn't a decision. It was my body taking over when my head could no longer pretend everything was under control. I went to bed at the usual time. I turned off the bedside lamp. I listened to Rosario's breathing become slow and regular beside me. She fell asleep in less than 10 minutes, as she always had, with that ease of someone who carries nothing heavy on their conscience or who has learned to carry it without it showing. I lay still in the darkness with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling I couldn't see. At 2 in the morning, I got up carefully. I went to the kitchen barefoot without turning on the hallway lights. I poured myself a glass of water from the tap and stood by the window looking at the empty street. The streetlights cast an orange glow on the wet pavement. It had rained while we were having dinner, and the asphalt was still shining. There was no one, just the reflection of the light on the ground and the silence of a sleeping city. I thought about calling Marcos, not to confront him, but to ask him why, to hear from his own voice some explanation that made human sense, some reason that would lessen the weight of what I'd seen written on page 4 of Valentin's report. I had the phone in my hand. His number, which I knew by heart since he was a teenager and had changed twice since, was 2 taps away. I didn't call him. I left it on the counter and drank the water slowly. There is a fundamental difference between what I needed at that moment and what would have been useful to do. Calling Marcos at 2 in the morning without complete evidence, without the closing of Valentine's report, without having everything I needed documented and in order, was exactly the kind of impulsive move that ruins in one night what has been carefully built over weeks. I knew it, and yet the impulse was there, real and concrete for several minutes. I stayed in the kitchen until 3:15. Then I went back to bed, lay down without making a sound, and stayed still until it started to get light. There's something no one tells you about these kinds of situations, that the hardest moment isn't the discovery. The discovery has its own adrenaline, its own brutal clarity that somehow sustains you. The hardest moment is what comes after, when you already know what you know and you still have to live as if you don't. When you have to sit down for breakfast opposite that person and ask them if they want milk in their coffee and listen to their answer and respond in turn normally, knowing what you know, holding what you're holding, waiting for the moment that hasn't yet arrived. That's what was hardest for me, not the anger, the waiting. That morning, while Rosario was making breakfast, her phone rang on the dining room table. She had her back to me in the kitchen. The phone vibrated once, and the screen lit up briefly with a message. I was sitting less than a meter away. I saw the sender's name before the screen went dark. Gerardo, no last name, just Gerardo. I filed that information away silently. Rosario came from the dining room, picked up the phone, read the message with her back to me, and put it in her pant pocket. Then she served the coffee as if nothing had happened. That afternoon, I called my sister Consuelo. I hadn't spoken to her for weeks beyond the usual short messages. Consuelo was 61. She'd lived alone since her husband passed away 4 years ago and was the person who knew me best in the world. Not because I had deliberately allowed her to, but because she had decided to know me anyway, regardless of what I facilitated or not. I called her from the prepaid mobile, not because I distrusted her, but because the habit of caution had already settled in me in a way that didn't distinguish between situations. She answered on the third ring with her usual voice, slightly hoarse in the mornings, full of that direct warmth that needs no preambles. Emilio, I've been waiting for this call for weeks. I told her I had something to tell her. I told her it was serious and that I needed her to listen without interrupting until I was finished. It was a brief silence. Then she said, "Speak." I spoke for 20 minutes. I told her everything since the barbecue, without omitting anything, in the same order it had happened. I heard her breathing on the other end of the line. When I finished, she was silent for a few seconds before answering. "How long have you been carrying this?" I just told her almost 2 months. Another silence. Then, "You're just like your father. May he rest in peace, but just as stubborn." It wasn't a reproach. It was her way of telling me she understood what it had cost me. I asked her not to say anything to anyone, not to make any moves, that the only thing I asked was for her to be available when the time came that I needed her. She said, of course. She also said something I didn't expect before hanging up. "Emilio, what you're feeling right now, that weight of knowing something you can't say yet, that doesn't make you weak, it makes you more careful than them, and that's exactly what you need to be." I hung up the phone and stayed in the car for a moment, which was where I had made the call, parked on a side street 3 blocks from home. The cold of the glass was noticeable through my coat. Outside, there was a gray December light that made everything look equally flat. What Consuelo said was true, but there was something else I hadn't told her, something I hadn't formulated out loud to anyone, because doing so would have meant admitting it in a different way. That version of myself who had believed for years that working hard was enough, that material stability was a form of love, that making ends meet without debt and with the children in good schools was the equivalent of being present. That version wasn't going to survive this, even if I won everything I had planned to win. I had paid a real price for the years I wasn't there. Not the price Rosario had decided to charge me without telling me. A different, more private one that only I could see clearly. Acknowledging it wasn't self-flagellation, it was honesty. And honesty at that moment was the only thing no one could take from me. I dedicated the following days to the second concrete application of what I knew how to do. I went to see Teodoro not as a conversation between friends, but as a client who needs specific technical advice. I explained without revealing more than necessary about the real state of things, that I wanted to review the legal composition of my assets and clearly separate which assets were exclusively mine by family inheritance and which were marital property. Teodoro listened. Then he looked at me with that expression of his, a notary who has spent decades seeing people arrive when it's almost too late. He didn't ask anything that wasn't strictly necessary. He took out the papers. We started to work. The apartment on Encarnacion Street was marital property. The joint Santander account marital property. The vehicle marital property. But the 48,000 euros fixed-term deposit had been established entirely with funds from my parents' inheritance, documented with a notarial deed of acceptance of inheritance from 2016. That made it separate property under the current community property regime. It wasn't divisible in a divorce. It was exclusively mine. Teodoro reviewed the documents I had brought, made 2 notes in his block, and said, "If someone tries to include it in a liquidation of community property, they have very little room to win. The documentation is impeccable." I told him I was glad to know that. When I left the notary's office, it was 6:15 in the evening, and the street was already dark, with the shop lights on and the December cold settled on the cobblestones of the city center. I put the documents in my briefcase and went to the car slowly. Valentine's final report was still pending. The 3 days he had asked for would be up the next day, and what remained to be confirmed, what he hadn't wanted to say yet without having it in writing, was the piece that completed or modified everything I had built up to that point. That night, I had dinner at home like any other night. Rosario had prepared baked cake. We ate without incident. She talked about a program she had seen in the afternoon, that we had to call the plumber about the leak, which was still unresolved, that Carmen would confirm her visit for the following weekend. I listened. I answered. I cleared the plates when we finished. Before falling asleep in the darkness of the bedroom, with Rosario's breathing becoming regular beside me, I thought about what Valentine would tell me the next day, and I thought that whatever it was, I was already prepared to hear it, but prepared and ready to take the blow are 2 different things. And what Valentine had kept for those 3 days was something that would confirm not only that the plan existed, but that it had been in motion for much longer than any of my calculations had contemplated. Valentine arrived at the cafeteria 5 minutes early. When I walked in, he already had the envelope on the table and his coffee untouched. That told me everything before I sat down, that what he brought wasn't something he wanted to delay. I sat down. I signaled the waiter to order the same as him. Valentine pushed the envelope towards me without a word. I opened it slowly. It was 6 pages this time, the previous 4 plus 2 new ones. The 2 new ones were the ones that mattered. The first contained a photocopy of a legal consultation document with a letterhead of Gerardo Palacios Vidal's firm, dated 3 months ago. At the bottom, in the space for the signatures of those present, there were 2 names, Rosario Valverde Diaz as the consulting party and Marcos Fuentes Valverde as a witness to the meeting. Witness, not a casual companion. Witness, a figure with specific legal weight that implies conscious and deliberate presence in the documented act, something that anyone with a law degree knows with absolute precision. The second new page was a summary prepared by Valentine in his own words based on information obtained through means he didn't specify and which I didn't ask about. What it described was this. The strategy Palacios Vidal had designed for Rosario wasn't an ordinary divorce. It was a contentious divorce with a request for attribution of the use of the family home, a claim for financial compensation for prolonged dedication to the home for over 2 decades, and most relevantly, a request for the liquidation of community property that included specific arguments about alleged emotional abandonment and sustained neglect during the marriage. To support that argument in court, the lawyer needed a witness who knew the dynamics of the marriage from the inside, someone credible, someone whose bond with the plaintiff was unquestionable. Marcos, my own son, was prepared to sit before a judge and testify that I had been a negligent, emotionally absent husband, that I had prioritized work over family for decades. All of this with the technical precision of someone who knows exactly which words carry weight in a family law proceeding and which do not. I read the 6 pages twice. Then I put them on the table and drank the coffee the waiter had left while I was reading. "Is there anything else that's not on paper?" I asked. Valentine held the cup between his 2 hands. "One thing. The lawyer has had 2 meetings in the last 3 months with a real estate appraiser, the same one who did the last valuation of the apartment on Encarnacion Street. The meetings aren't related to any open sale file. I didn't need him to explain. They were valuing the main asset before requesting the liquidation to know exactly how much they could claim and on what terms. I paid Valentine what we'd agreed, plus an additional amount for the extra days. We shook hands. Before I got up, he told me just one more thing. Fuentes, move before they do. When the lawyer files the lawsuit, your room to maneuver shrinks. He was right, and I already knew it. I left Segovia with the envelope in my briefcase and a clarity in my head I hadn't felt since the beginning of all this. It wasn't the clarity of someone who no longer feels anything. It was the specific clarity of someone who has finished gathering everything they needed and now knows exactly what needs to be done and in what order. The same day, before returning to Valladolid, I stopped at a gas station on the highway and called Teodoro from the prepaid mobile. I told him I needed to see him first thing the next day, that it was urgent, and that we had to close what we had left open in the previous meeting. Teodoro said he'd be at the notary's office at 9. The next day, I was with him for 2 hours. We reviewed the documentation for the fixed-term deposit and formalized the legal separation of that asset as a separate property by notarial act with all the inheritance documents attached. We also reviewed the will I had modified weeks before and confirmed that everything was in order. Teodoro drafted an additional asset inventory document that detailed with dates and origins each existing asset. It was the type of documentation that in a legal proceeding forces the opposing party to prove what they allege instead of simply alleging it. When we finished, Teodoro collected the papers with his usual deliberateness and looked at me over his glasses. Are you going to tell me what's really going on? I told him enough. Not everything, but enough for him to understand the context without needing the details. Teodoro listened. When I finished, he nodded slowly and said, "The documentation we've prepared is solid. If someone tries to move what they can't move, they're going to hit a wall." That was exactly what I needed to hear. The following week was the most tense of the entire process for one specific reason. Rosario's attitude changed in a way that wasn't dramatic or obvious. But for me, after weeks of observing every detail, it was immediately perceptible. She started asking me questions about money with a studied naturalness she didn't have before. If I had renewed the fixed-term deposit, if I had thought about changing banks now that I was retired, if Teodoro had suggested anything new in the last meetings. The questions were reasonable separately. Together in that specific week, they had a clear direction. The most compromising moment happened on a Wednesday morning. I was in the study with the deposit documentation on the table, checking that everything was in order before putting it away for good in the place where no one but me had access. Rosario came in without knocking, just as she had weeks before. This time, I didn't have time to close the folder. She saw the papers. She saw them clearly. Her gaze rested a second longer than normal on the notary's letterhead peeking out on the first page. "What's that?" she asked. Her voice was completely neutral. Too neutral. "The life insurance," I replied without hesitation. Teodoro told me to review the conditions now that I changed the will. "These are the supporting documents he asked for." She looked at the folder for another moment. Then she looked at me. "Did you change anything important?" "I updated some things that were outdated, nothing that affects our day-to-day." She nodded. She left the study. I closed the folder, put it in the locked drawer of my desk, the only lock in that room she couldn't open, and I stood still, listening to her footsteps moving away towards the kitchen. I had been a centimeter away from her seeing exactly what documents they were. If she had arrived 30 seconds earlier, or if I had taken 30 seconds longer to react, the answer I had given her would have had no visual support. But the folder was oriented so that the visible letterhead was from the insurance company, which also had documents in that same folder. That's what saved the moment. That night, I made the decision about the timeline. I couldn't wait any longer. Valentine had warned me that Rosario's lawyer could file the lawsuit at any time from then on. Every additional day of waiting was a day in which the initiative could change hands. I called Consuelo that same night and told her I needed her the following Tuesday. I told her the time, and I told her to come to the apartment, that the task I had to do required someone trustworthy to be present. She asked if she should know anything else. I told her no, that just arriving at 10 in the morning was enough. Then I opened my phone and looked for Marcos's number. What I wrote wasn't a letter. It wasn't an explanation. It was 3 sentences with no affectionate greeting, no insult, no element that could be interpreted as an opening for a response. The rent for the apartment will no longer be debited from my account starting the first day of next month. You have 30 days to manage the change. The health plan and the card are canceled on the last day of this month. No signature, nothing else. I sent the message. I left the phone on the table. I didn't wait for a reply because there wasn't going to be one that mattered. Marcos replied 40 minutes later with a 2-line message asking what was going on. I didn't open it. I left it unread that night, and the next day, and all the days that followed. All that was left was Tuesday. All that was left was Consuelo in the living room at 10 in the morning. All that was left was sitting across from Rosario with everything I had gathered for weeks spread out on the table, without anger, without a prepared speech, just with the cold precision of someone who has done the work that had to be done. But that night, as I was putting the last documents in my briefcase and checking that everything was where it should be, there was a moment when I wondered if Rosario already knew what was coming. If something in the last few days had given her a sign I hadn't seen. If on Tuesday I was going to find someone who still didn't expect it or someone who had already prepared to receive it. That question had no answer that night. I would have it on Tuesday at 10. The briefcase had been by the office door since the night before, closed, with the lock turned all the way, just as I left it when I had an important meeting the next day and didn't want to be looking for anything at the last minute. That Tuesday, I had prepared it with the same methodology with which for decades I had prepared the most complicated tax inspections. Each document in its order, each piece of evidence identified, each possible response from the other party considered in advance. At 9:45, Consuelo buzzed from the street. I went down to let her in. She looked me in the face on the landing without saying anything for a second. Then she briefly put a hand on my arm, the gesture of someone who doesn't need words to say what matters, and we went in together. Rosario was in the kitchen when we arrived. I heard the sound of the coffee maker. I went into the living room. I put the briefcase on the dining table, opened it, and began to arrange the documents in the order I had decided on the night before. Consuelo sat in the armchair in the corner without me asking. She knew exactly what her role was. To be present, to be a witness, not to intervene unless necessary. Rosario appeared at the living room door with 2 cups of coffee. She stopped when she saw Consuelo. Then she looked at the table, the papers spread out, the open briefcase. Her expression took a moment to compose itself. "I didn't know you were coming," she said to Consuelo with a politeness that sounded forced. "Emilio asked me to be here." Consuelo replied from the armchair without moving, with that calm of hers that had always been hard to disconcert. Rosario put the cups on the side table. She looked at me. "What's going on?" I pointed to the chair opposite me. "Sit down, please." There was a moment of hesitation. Then she sat. I started at the beginning, not with the barbecue, not with the toast, but with something more concrete and harder to refute. I placed the first bank statement with the marked transactions in front of her. 43 transfers, 41,200 euros, dates, amounts, destination account number, all in writing, all verifiable. "This account is in your name," I said. "You opened it 6 months before the first transfer. It's been active for 3 years. Rosario looked at the papers. She didn't pick them up. She looked at them from where she was with a stillness that told me she wasn't as surprised as an innocent person should have been. "That's my money," she said. "I have the right to have my own account." "Yes," I replied, "but you don't have the right to transfer funds from the joint account to that account without the knowledge or consent of the co-owner. That has a legal name." Silence. I put the second document on top of the first, the list from the bag, the one I had found that Saturday in October with my details crossed out and hers written above. I had made a photocopy before folding it back up and putting it where it was. Rosario recognized it immediately. I knew from the way her breathing changed, almost imperceptibly, but enough. "That's a personal note," she said. "It has no value." "I'm not putting it here for its legal value," I replied. "I'm putting it here because it's the point where I started to understand what was happening. The third document was Valentine's report. Not all of it, just the relevant pages, the 6 visits to Palacios Vidal's office, documented with dates and times, and the photocopy of the consultation document with Marcos' signature at the bottom. It was upon seeing that paper that Rosario truly reacted, not with surprise, but with something more like a rapid assessment of someone who is gauging how much the other knows and how much they can still deny. "This is an invasion of my privacy," she said. Her voice had risen half a tone. It wasn't anger yet. It was the first defensive line of someone who knows the second is harder to hold. "You've been meeting with a lawyer specializing in contentious divorces for 8 months. I said in the same tone I would have read a balance sheet aloud. "Marcos signed as a witness in a legal consultation at that office 3 months ago. He has a law degree. He knew exactly what he was signing. Marcos' name in that context was what broke her composure. "Don't bring Marcos into this," she said. Her voice changed. Now, there was anger, but it was a defensive anger, that of someone trying to protect something they already know they can't protect. "Marcos was already in this," I replied. "He chose it with all the information and with all the training to understand what he was choosing." Consuelo didn't move from the armchair. She said nothing. Her presence in the room was simply that presence. But it was the presence of someone who was seeing and remembering every detail. Rosario tried the third line. She leaned forward slightly and changed her tone to something lower, closer to negotiation than confrontation. "Emilio, we can talk about this in a different way. If there are things that aren't working between us, there are ways to resolve it without resorting to this." "You've been resolving it for 8 months, I said, "with a lawyer specializing in the liquidation of community property and with our son as a witness. What we have on this table is the result of that resolution." The fourth document was the notarial act of the fixed-term deposit as separate property with all the inheritance documentation attached. I placed it on top of the previous ones with the same calm with which I had placed the others. "The €48,000 deposit is not a community asset," I said. "It comes entirely from my parents' inheritance documented before a notary in 2016. It doesn't enter into any liquidation. It's beyond the reach of any lawsuit." Rosario looked at that document for several seconds. I saw that she was processing it. I also saw the exact moment she understood that the centerpiece of what Palacios Vidal had built had just disappeared from the game. What came next was desperation, not the explosive or dramatic kind, but that of someone trying to find exits where there are none left. She said I had acted behind her back, that I had spied on her, that I had violated her privacy, that all this was a disproportionate reaction to things that had an explanation. She spoke for several minutes. I let her speak. I didn't interrupt her once. When she finished, I said, "The account you opened in secret, the systematic transfers, the meetings with the lawyer, Marcos' signature on the consultation document. All of that is dated before anything I've done in recent months." A long silence. The kind of silence that has no answer because there isn't one that works. Then, in a lower voice, with a fatigue that sounded genuine for the first time in the whole conversation, Rosario said, "What do you want me to do?" It was the first real question of the whole morning. I told her what I had agreed with Teodoro, what belonged to each of us according to the law, no more and no less. The community property would be divided according to the established regime. The separate deposit remained outside. The transfers to the secret account would be counted as an advance on her proportional share in the liquidation. There was no added punishment, no demand for unilateral renunciation, just the exact application of what the law established, with no room for the strategy Palacios Vidal had designed, because that strategy depended on a favorable liquidation that the documentation on the table made impossible. Consuelo got up from the armchair at that moment, picked up her bag, and said she was going to wait in the kitchen. She did it with a discretion I appreciated without saying so. Some things, even if necessary, don't need more witnesses than are essential. Rosario and I were left alone in the living room for 20 more minutes. I'm not going to detail everything that was said in those 20 minutes. What I will say is that at some point near the end of that conversation, Rosario said something I didn't expect. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a full acknowledgement of what she had done. It was a sentence spoken in a very low voice, looking at the table instead of at me. I didn't think you'd go this far. I didn't answer that sentence. There was nothing to add that wouldn't worsen what had already been said. What I did say to her before I got up and collected the papers was this: the sentence you said at the barbecue in front of the children, telling me I was going to die alone. That after no one would look at me twice. That was the last time you were right about anything that had to do with me. I left the living room. I went to the kitchen where Consuelo was. She looked at me and said nothing. She made coffee for both of us, and we sat at the small kitchen table in silence with the cups between our hands. While outside, the January morning went on as if nothing had happened inside that apartment. What came after was slow and bureaucratic, the way legal processes are slow and bureaucratic when one of the parties no longer has arguments to prolong them. Palacios Vidal tried to reframe the strategy twice. Both times he hit the same documentary wall. 4 months later, the separation agreement was signed according to the terms I had put on the table that Tuesday in January. Rosario went to live with her sister while the allocation of the apartment was being resolved. We saw each other 3 more times during the process, always with the lawyers present, always with the cold distance of 2 people who are ending a contract, not a life. It took Marcos 6 weeks to call me. When he did, I let the phone ring to the end. Not because I had anything to gain by ignoring him, but because I had nothing to hear that would change what I already knew. 2 weeks later, he sent me a longer message with explanations that mixed justification with something that could have been the beginning of an acknowledgement. I read it once. I saved it. I didn't reply. The consequences for him were what I said they would be, without drama, without a speech, without a scene. The rent, the health plan, the card, all canceled within the deadlines I had communicated. Marcos is 26, has a law degree and the necessary tools to build his own life. What he does with them is his decision, as was the decision to enter that office and sign as a witness. There's something I didn't expect to gain in all this, and that turned out to be the most valuable. Not the documents, not the deposit, not the fair settlement. It was the certainty that came gradually in the following months that the silence with which I had responded to Rosario that October afternoon at the barbecue had not been resignation. It never had been. It was the beginning of something she couldn't see because she had spent years interpreting my stillness as passivity. She was wrong. You were always here, Emilio, but you never fully arrived. That's what she told me on our 25th anniversary. And she was partly right. I was late to many things for many years. That's true, and I don't erase it. But when I finally decided to arrive, I arrived with everything.